You may think your cucumber plants failed because the weather was bad or because the seeds were not good enough. But after growing cucumbers for many years, I can tell you that most people lose more than half of their harvest, long before the first cucumber is ready to pick. The surprising part is that they do not even realize they are making the same mistakes every single season. I used to blame the heat, the rain, and even insects until an old gardener showed me that the real problem was much closer than I wanted to admit. Once I understood what he meant, my cucumber beds changed completely, and I started picking fresh cucumbers almost every day, while my neighbors were still wondering why their vines looked healthy but produced so little. If you stay with me, I will show you the 5 biggest mistakes that quietly steal your harvest. And I promise these are simple things that almost anyone can fix without spending extra money. I am not here to sell you expensive products because cucumbers do not care how much money you spend. They only respond to how you treat them every day. I have seen people buy costly fertilizers, special supports, and every new bottle on the garden shelf, yet they still end up disappointed because they ignored the small things that matter much more. The funny part is that some of the best advice I ever received came from a man who never bought fancy garden products in his life. He simply watched his plants carefully and learned what they were trying to tell him. That lesson stayed with me, and I still follow it today. Every summer I see the same pattern. Beautiful green vines full of leaves but very few cucumbers. Tiny fruits that suddenly turn yellow. Flowers that disappear without becoming anything. People think this is normal, but it really is not. Most of these problems begin with a mistake that happens before the plants even start growing well. Once that mistake is made, the plant spends the rest of the season trying to recover instead of producing food for you. That first mistake is so common that I would say almost every beginner makes it, and even experienced gardeners often overlook it because it seems too simple to matter. But once you understand why it happens, you will never look at your cucumber plants the same way again. Is everything okay? If you say yes, continue, I'll write the next block following exactly the same rules. The first mistake I was talking about begins before people even notice anything is wrong, because they see green leaves and think everything is fine. I used to think exactly the same way until one season I watched my cucumber plants grow fast and cover the trellis with healthy vines, but week after week the harvest stayed small. I kept watering and feeding them, hoping they would suddenly start producing more, but nothing changed. Then an older gardener asked me one simple question. He said, "Where are your roots growing?" I looked at him because I did not understand what he meant. He walked over to one of my plants and gently moved the soil with his hand. The surface was dry and cracked, while only the top inch had been getting water. He smiled and said, "This plant is surviving instead of growing." That day, I learned something I never forgot. Many people water cucumbers too often, but not deeply enough. They give the plants a little drink every day and think they are helping, but they are actually teaching the roots to stay close to the surface, where the soil dries out the fastest. Then one hot afternoon arrives, and suddenly the leaves begin to wilt, the flowers fall off, and tiny cucumbers stop growing. The plant spends all its strength trying to stay alive instead of making fruit. Since then, I have changed the way I water completely. I water less often, but I make sure the moisture reaches deep into the ground, where the roots really belong. After that, I cover the soil with a simple layer of straw or dry grass, because this old method keeps the moisture where the plant needs it and saves both water and effort. It costs almost nothing and anyone can do it. Many people skip this small step because it looks too ordinary to matter, but I have seen the difference with my own eyes. The soil stays cooler even during the hottest days, and the plants remain calm instead of struggling every afternoon. Another mistake happens right here, because some gardeners think adding more water is the answer whenever leaves start drooping. Sometimes that only makes the problem worse because the roots cannot breathe in constantly wet soil. Learning when not to water is just as important as learning when to water. Once you understand that simple balance, your cucumber plants begin to reward you with stronger vines, healthier flowers, and far more fruit than before. But watering is still not the biggest reason people lose their harvest, because the next mistake quietly steals cucumbers even from plants that seem perfectly healthy, and most gardeners never notice it until the season is almost over. The second mistake is one that looks completely harmless, because the plants keep growing and the garden looks full and green. I made this mistake for years, and I know many people still do it without realizing what it costs them. We love seeing long cucumber vines because they make us feel like everything is going well. The problem is that a cucumber plant can spend all of its energy producing leaves instead of fruit if you let it grow without paying attention. I remember an older man showing me his small garden many years ago. His cucumber plants did not look as wild as mine, but every time I visited, he had a bucket full of fresh cucumbers waiting by the door. I finally asked him what his secret was. He smiled and walked over to one of the vines. Without any hesitation, he removed several old yellow leaves near the bottom and pinched off a weak side shoot that was growing in the wrong direction. Then he looked at me and said, "The plant should feed cucumbers, not unnecessary leaves." That simple sentence stayed with me ever since. Many gardeners are afraid to remove anything because they think every leaf is helping the plant. Of course, healthy leaves are important, but when the lower part becomes crowded with old leaves and tangled shoots, the air cannot move properly. Moisture stays trapped after rain or watering, and little by little diseases begin to appear. The plant becomes busy supporting too much green growth, while fewer flowers develop into cucumbers. Since I started removing only the oldest damaged leaves and keeping the vines open, I noticed something surprising. The flowers received more light, the leaves dried faster after rain, and the harvest became much more consistent. This is not about cutting the plant heavily, because that would also be a mistake. It is simply about helping the plant use its strength wisely. Very few people take a few quiet minutes every week just to look carefully at their cucumber vines. They rush through watering and walk away. I like to stand there for a moment and watch. The plant usually tells me exactly what it needs if I pay attention. That habit has saved me from many problems before they became serious. But there is another mistake that causes even bigger disappointment because it happens when the flowers appear. People become excited, expecting dozens of cucumbers, and then they cannot understand why many flowers simply fall to the ground without producing anything at all. That is where the next lesson begins. The third mistake is probably the most frustrating, because everything seems to be going well until the flowers appear. You walk into the garden one morning and see bright yellow blossoms everywhere. You smile because you already imagine baskets full of fresh cucumbers. Then a few days later, many of those flowers dry up and fall to the ground. Tiny cucumbers start forming but suddenly stop growing and turn yellow. I remember standing there years ago wondering what I had done wrong. I thought maybe the plants needed more fertilizer or more water, but an older grower quietly told me to stop guessing and start watching the flowers. That advice changed the way I looked at cucumber plants forever. He explained that not every flower becomes a cucumber and that the plant depends on good pollination to keep producing. Many people never think about this because they assume nature will handle everything on its own. Most years it does, but not always. If bees and other helpful insects do not visit often enough, many flowers simply disappear without giving you any harvest. That is why I stopped making my garden look too clean. Years ago, I used to remove every little wildflower around my vegetable beds because I wanted everything to look perfect. Now I leave a few simple flowers nearby and I notice far more bees moving through the garden every morning. It costs nothing and the difference is easy to see. Sometimes if the weather stays rainy for several days and I notice very few insects flying, I even help the plants myself by gently moving pollen from one flower to another with a small soft brush. It only takes a few minutes and it has saved part of my harvest more than once. Very few people do this because they think it sounds unnecessary until they see how many extra cucumbers begin to grow afterward. At the same time, I avoid feeding my plants with too much nitrogen once flowering begins, because that often gives me more leaves instead of more cucumbers. The goal is not to grow the biggest vine. The goal is to fill the kitchen with fresh cucumbers week after week. Every little decision should help the plant produce fruit instead of wasting energy. Once I understood this simple lesson, my harvest became much more reliable even during difficult summers. But there is one more mistake that quietly destroys many cucumber plants long before the season ends, and it usually starts with something people believe is actually helping their garden. The fourth mistake is one that fooled me for a very long time because I honestly believed I was protecting my cucumber plants. Every time I noticed the first yellow leaf or a few small insects, I immediately reached for a spray bottle. Sometimes it was a homemade mixture and sometimes it was something I bought at the garden store. I thought acting quickly was always the best choice. Then one season I noticed something strange. The insects disappeared for a while, but my plants still looked tired and the harvest kept getting smaller. That was when an old gardener asked me another simple question. He said, "Have you looked under the leaves before you spray?" I had to admit that most of the time I had not. From that day on, I stopped rushing and started observing first. Many problems begin on the underside of the leaves where people rarely look. Sometimes it is only a few pests that can easily be removed before they spread. Sometimes it is simply an old leaf that has finished its job and needs to be taken away. I also learned that spraying in the middle of a hot sunny day can do more harm than good, because wet leaves under strong sunlight become stressed and sometimes even damaged. Now, if I ever need to spray, I do it early in the morning or later in the evening when the air is cooler and the plants have time to dry naturally. Another habit I changed was keeping the area around my cucumbers clean without making it completely bare. I remove diseased leaves as soon as I see them, and I never leave them lying under the plants, because that only invites more trouble. At the same time, I leave enough mulch on the soil to keep moisture steady and prevent mud from splashing onto the leaves during heavy rain. It is a simple balance that costs almost nothing but saves a great deal of work later in the season. Very few people understand that healthy cucumber plants are usually the result of many small decisions instead of one miracle treatment. I have watched neighbors spend money on stronger sprays every year while ignoring the simple habits that prevent most problems from appearing in the first place. Once I stopped fighting my garden and started working with it, everything became easier. The vines stayed healthier, the leaves remained greener, and I spent far less time dealing with problems. But there is still one final mistake that quietly reduces the harvest even when everything else seems to be done correctly, and it is the mistake that many experienced gardeners continue making year after year without even noticing it. The fifth and biggest mistake is believing that the season is almost over as soon as the first good harvest arrives. I used to think exactly like that. Once I filled a few baskets with cucumbers, I relaxed and assumed the plants would continue producing on their own until autumn. Every year I noticed the same thing. The vines slowly became weaker, the cucumbers became smaller, and before long the harvest almost stopped. I blamed the weather because that seemed like the easiest explanation. Then one summer an older gardener visited me and watched as I picked several large cucumbers that I had somehow missed the day before. He smiled and said that every cucumber left too long on the vine tells the plant that its job is almost finished. I never forgot those words because after I started picking cucumbers regularly, everything changed. Now I walk through my garden every morning or every other morning during the busiest part of the season. Even if I only find one or two cucumbers, I harvest them while they are still firm, fresh and full of flavor. The plant immediately begins putting its energy into producing new flowers, instead of feeding old fruit that has already done its job. This simple habit costs nothing, but gives me many more cucumbers over the entire season. Very few people realize how quickly one forgotten oversized cucumber can slow down the whole plant. I have even hidden one by accident under a large leaf and discovered it several days later almost as big as my arm. After removing it, the plant slowly returned to producing new flowers again. Another thing I always do is keep watching the vines, instead of assuming they no longer need attention after the first harvest. I continue watering deeply. When needed, I keep the mulch in place and I remove old damaged leaves little by little so the plant keeps breathing and growing. None of these jobs takes very long, but together they make an enormous difference. People often ask me what expensive fertilizer I use to keep harvesting for so many weeks. They are surprised when I tell them that consistency is far more valuable than expensive products. A few quiet minutes in the garden every few days will often produce better results than another bottle from the store. That is probably the oldest lesson I ever learned about growing vegetables. Nature rewards patience much more than speed. And when you combine all 5 of these simple lessons together, you begin to understand why some gardens continue filling baskets long after others have already stopped producing. In the final part, I want to show you how these small changes come together and why they can completely change the way you grow cucumbers every single year. When I look back at all the seasons I have spent growing cucumbers, I realize that my biggest improvements never came from expensive products or complicated methods. They came from fixing small mistakes that I repeated year after year without noticing them. Once I learned to water deeply instead of often, my plants became stronger. Once I stopped letting the vines become too crowded, they stayed healthier for much longer. Once I paid attention to pollination, I watched more flowers turn into fresh cucumbers. Once I stopped rushing to spray every little problem and started observing first, I spent less money and enjoyed healthier plants. And once I began harvesting regularly, instead of waiting for every cucumber to become as large as possible, my plants rewarded me with harvest after harvest. None of these lessons is difficult, and none of them requires special equipment. That is exactly why many people ignore them. We often believe the answer must be complicated because simple things seem too ordinary to make a real difference. After many years in the garden, I have learned that nature usually works the other way around. The simplest habits repeated at the right time almost always give the biggest rewards. Every season I still learn something new, because every garden is a little different, and every summer teaches another lesson if we are willing to pay attention. That is one of the reasons I still enjoy growing cucumbers after so many years. It is not only about filling baskets with fresh vegetables, it is about walking outside in the morning, seeing healthy green vines, and knowing that the small efforts you made every week quietly turned into something your family can enjoy. If this season has been disappointing, do not give up, because most failures can be corrected with just a few simple changes. Start with one habit, then add another, and before long you will notice that your garden begins to respond in ways you did not expect. Next season you may be the person sharing cucumbers with neighbors instead of wondering why your plants produce so little. And there is one more old gardening habit that has helped me grow healthier vegetables with even less work. Very few people use it anymore, but once you see how simple it is, you may never garden the same way again.